A number of high-profile comics have recently been announced, but between Noel fighting Mary Jane / Venom for the first time, and Jeff the Shark crossing over with Crypto the Superdog, yes, those are things that are happening right now in comics, the one announcement that got the biggest reaction from fans and audiences online appears to be the revival of the Spider-Man 90s animated series as a comic. After over a year of begging Disney and Marvel to revive the second most popular animated series based on a Marvel comic from the 90s, a very specific niche I might add, it looks like they're finally doing it in comic book form. Now, on one hand, this might be a little disappointing to longtime fans who were hoping that Marvel and Disney, after the success of X-Men 97, might revive their most popular, again, second most popular, animated series from the 90s back. Give us a sixth season, because the original show ended on a cliffhanger.
We are going to find the real Mary Jane Watson.
What? Hey, wait a minute, what happened? What happens next? Come on, let's see the next episode!
That's it?
What?
The show was cancelled after that.
There is no real substitute for a full-blown animated season revival of a show that you love. But there might be some reason to take pause here. There's some red flags I'm spotting, at least, that have me tempering my expectations. I'm not as hyped as many other people online might be, even though I am a big Spider-Man fan and grew up with this cartoon like so many others. Not to rain on your parade, not to be a negative Nancy here, but there are a few things that have me worried that maybe won't make the comic bad. It might be fantastic for all I know. I hope I'm wrong. But I can't get as excited as everyone else is about this announcement.
Follow-up comics to popular iterations of characters are fairly commonplace now. DC really got in the swing of it before, following up everything from the Richard Donner Superman to the Tim Burton Batman to the Linda Carter Wonder Woman, though the real origin point of this trend came from the revival of the classic Adam West Batman series. Because the actors were so old, they couldn't just come up on TV and play the characters yet again. So comic and animation were the platforms through which they could revive this classic show for fans who had grown up loving it.
We're done with your ghoulish games.
Still, a 90s Spider-Man follow-up. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. The original animated series is a true landmark for superhero animation, especially Spider-Man animation. Before you had the 60s show, which is memed and infamous, sure, but you also had Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the often forgotten 80s Spider-Man cartoon. There's also the Electric Company, but that's a little more obscure and that was made directly for kids, so we're not going to discuss that right now. Suffice to say, Spidey never had that perfect adaptation prior to the 90s, and that's thanks to John Semper Jr., the showrunner of the 90s Spider-Man show, who managed to elevate the material to a new level. Semper was the first black showrunner for a cartoon airing on Saturday morning, so that's a landmark right there, even ignoring the fact that his show happened to be really good. And he worked hard. He had to fight with producer Avi Arad on just about everything. Arad, you may not remember this, he's the same guy who forced Sam Raimi to include Venom in Spider-Man 3. He's basically seen as more of a hindrance at best and a disaster at worst. He's also the same guy who pushed for the whole Sony cinematic universe of characters around Spider-Man, but not including Spider-Man. So you can thank Avi Arad for Morbius coming on screen and morbing all over the place. And Arad saw the Spider-Man cartoon as an opportunity to sell toys first and foremost. That was his business at the time. So he pushed for it to be more toyific. In case you're not aware, that's the same mindset that ruined Batman and Robin. Semper had to fight for quality control constantly. The only reason this show is worth a damn is because of Semper.
Add to that other limitations Semper had. Now, parents at that time, especially, were very worried cartoons were corrupting the youth. They couldn't be too violent, otherwise the kids might copy the violence. This is the same era where we had all the warnings on toys saying, hey, parents, remember you can't let your kids swallow the little Star Wars figurines, they might choke on it, something like that. A lot of cartoons had loosened up the restrictions in the 80s, and now we're seeing parents kind of push back against the maybe a little bit too much freedom that animators had depicting violence to their kids, at least for the time being. But some of these limitations were kind of bizarre. Semper had to navigate the complicated web of censorship and limitations facing the cartoon throughout the 90s. For example, Spider-Man could not punch anyone. And there are only like a couple scenes at the whole show where he punches someone. One of which being that scene where the Spot shows up and Spider-Man has to punch through a portal to hit the Spot. But very often it was kicks, web swings, and like just general fighting maneuvers, like grappling, but not a physical punch. But there were other restrictions too. For example, Semper could not use Electro or Sandman because at the time, James Cameron was working on his Spider-Man film, and they didn't want to have the same villains that Cameron would use in his film. Later on, Electro showed up, but Sandman never actually did. In fact, Hydro Man kind of takes the role that Sandman would ordinarily play, albeit they went in some odd directions, making Hydro Man an obsessed stalker of Mary Jane, who eventually clones Mary Jane after she's lost another dimension. The cartoon's weird, I'm just pointing that right there. There's a lot of oddities like that. In fact, even Mary Jane falling into another dimension, that was another case of censorship, because they couldn't show anyone dying in the cartoon. Everyone's trapped in another reality, or they get buried under rubble and their fate's ambiguous. It happens to Mysterio specifically. A whole system collapses on top of him and he seemingly dies. We have no confirmation, but we can assume he's dead under tons and tons of rubble. We'll get to that later, but I digress. But Semper did a lot of interesting things with Spider-Man in this cartoon. Semper pushed for long story arcs, held together by loose episodic adventures. He found ways to slip some of his favorite characters, like Blade and Doctor Strange, into the mix, without much effort. Noticeably, he put the Punisher in a children's cartoon, and somehow did a good job adapting the Punisher. By the way, the Punisher started off as a Spider-Man villain, which makes his inclusion in the next Spider-Man film very interesting. Oh, and one more thing too. Semper's biggest contribution to Spider-Man lore is the black symbiote suit. Obviously, the symbiote originates from the 80s, from Secret Wars into the 80s with the Spider-Man comic run, but a lot of the elements that we assume were inherent to the original comic book run actually come from Semper's rewrite and adaptation of the story for kids in the 90s. You know, for example, how the symbiote makes you all aggressive and angry and edgy. That's from the comics, right? Well, no, it's from the 90s cartoon. The comics is just an alien suit. There's no change in Peter's personality. He's creeped out by how affectionately it holds him and clings to him. That's not the same case as in the 90s cartoon, however. In the 90s cartoon, the reason he separates with it is because it makes him act uncontrollable, makes him act unreasonable.
Okay, Stephen, so this is important. The client has expressed they'd really like to stress certain words within the script.
Okay.
And the words he'd like you to stress are...
So the cartoon was already a huge success, so why am I so concerned with this comic revival? Well, maybe because Semper has no involvement in it.
So look, the 90s cartoon is a beloved classic. Yeah, but this revival still has a few warning signs that I'm picking up on, and I can't be blindly excited for something without also acknowledging there may be some issues ahead. And the first controversy is the easiest to break down, so let's talk about that first. Semper was not asked to return to the comic. Hell, he found out Marvel was making the comic from the announcement online. No one told the guy. He has no involvement, no connection to this project. The man responsible for this cartoon being what it is wasn't even sent an email about it. Now, the writer they did get is the great J.M. DeMatteis, who had penned some of the best Spider-Man stories out there, including Kraven's Last Hunt and the death of Harry Osborn, the death of Aunt May. These are some of the best written Spider-Man stories in his entire history, and many of them were written when he picked up work from other writers, such as David Michelin. He also started the Clone Saga, which arguably is the best part of the Clone Saga. It got worse as it went on, but he got the initial good bits done, the foundation upon which everything else was built. So even when he didn't exactly get the best comics out there, he still wrote the best parts of those not-so-great comic arts. DeMatteis is a great writer. Undeniably, his involvement is very encouraging, but he's not Semper.
DeMatteis isn't writing for the mainline comics. He's continuing a cartoon made for all ages. A cartoon defined by censorship, limitations, and adapting storylines to be less adult, not more adult. The 90s cartoon was never as dark, mature, or frankly as disturbing as the 90s X-Men cartoon, which wasn't as affected by serious censorship until the final season of the show, which, to be frank, still ended with Professor X seemingly dying. Consider this. The Sinister Six had to be renamed in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon to be the Insidious Six, and the reason was because censors thought that Sinister was just too sinister for young audiences. It was too scary. This is while the X-Men cartoon had a main villain named Mr. Sinister.
Your genetic material will be the foundation, the master bloodline for an unbeatable race of mutants who will be my slaves.
So X-Men could have Sinister, but the Spider-Man couldn't? The censors wouldn't allow vampires to drink blood on screen, so instead Morbius drank plasma out of these suckers he sprouted from his palm. And he'd grab hold of people and suck them dry from like little suction cup fanged things on his hands. Which, granted, I think is more frightening than a vampire just biting you in the neck. I don't know. Vampire teeth versus weird alien body horror coming out of your hand. I think that's the more frightening option. I think Morbius should have worked with that, but given Jared Leto's history, I think the idea of something coming out of a person's hand and sucking them dry might be a little problematic, I don't know what to tell you. Point is, Semper made a great show, despite great limitations. In fact, maybe he made it because of the limitations that forced him to get creative and unusual with the subject matter. It allowed him to make something very unique in the landscape of superhero adaptations. While it did affect the final product, he did not allow these limitations to compromise the final product.
This is going to be a little more controversial. Yeah, the cartoon is a classic, but and I'm going to be honest here, I was never someone who was clamoring for it to come back. I know a lot of people were, and I appreciate that, and I do love this cartoon. Don't get me wrong. And don't get me wrong also, the cameos in the X-Men 97 series where we saw Peter Parker with Mary Jane and Spider-Man swinging right back in, that got me hyped as all hell. I get that. And the series did end on a cliffhanger. Again, I get that. But I felt like by the time we reached season 5 of the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, we had kind of hit the end of the story. It ends pretty conclusively. Even though there's a cliffhanger, it ends on a way that's very satisfactory to the viewer. And look at it like this. The last season of Spider-Man, the animated series, does feel like a finale. Mary Jane and Spider-Man marry, even though she turns to be a clone, they still get married, and there is still that kind of conclusion to the will they won't they story that's been brewing throughout the entire series. Spider-Man beats the majority of his big villains, and then he ends up going to Secret Wars, where he leads every Marvel superhero in a war with the biggest villains of their universe. And then after that, engages in the very first Spider-Verse crossover, where Madam Web and the Beyonder bring Peter Parker to meet his various multiversal counterparts in order to fight Spider-Carnage, a true worst-case scenario for Peter Parker, where he's overcome by grief and existential dread, and then merges with the Carnage symbiote. This felt like a fulfillment of all the plot the show had been building up to, especially with Madam Web's subtle training sequences throughout Season 3. And then Peter Parker, after beating Spider-Carnage, meets Stan Lee, the creator of Spider-Man, and they go on a swing together. It feels like this real meta kind of last bow before the end. You really can't follow up Spider-Man's swing with Stan Lee and say, oh, there's actually more of the story. That's not even the best we got so far. You really can't top that.
We all have to grow up sometime, I suppose. Even us characters of fiction.
Whatever you could follow up with, honestly, would feel like a formality just to bring Mary Jane back from the other dimension Green Goblin left her in. Even though we know Spidey is going to get Mary Jane because Madam Web told us already.
Face front, true believer. We are going to find the real Mary Jane Watson.
So we're just being shown what we know is already going to be happening. It's not necessarily continuing the story, it's just showing us something that we knew was going to happen, but just didn't see on screen.
Another thing is that the vast majority of villains Spider-Man faced had pretty definitive defeats come the last 3 seasons of the show. Electro is trapped in another reality. Doc Ock and Red Skull get pretty firmly defeated during the Secret Wars event. Kingpin, he's arrested. Carnage loses his symbiote, and said symbiote is crushed between dimensions alongside the evil Peter Parker known as Spider-Carnage. Hobgoblin is exposed as Macendale and arrested. Norman Osborn remains trapped in limbo. Again, a lot of dimension traveling here, used to avoid saying the D word, the unalive word, one might say. Harry Osborn redeems himself, while his father yells at him to continue his work. Again, another component that was kind of continued in the Raimi films. Venom is trapped in another dimension after redeeming himself fighting Dormammu. Dormammu's cult is destroyed. Mysterio is crushed under tons of rubble. The Lizard is reformed, kinda. The Vampire Queen who Blade is fighting, who Morbius and Blackhead end up fighting, is defeated. Alistair Smythe, the creator of the Spider Slayers, is kinda sort of reformed at the end of it. Sure, there's some minor bad guys like Shocker. He's still at large, but the vast majority of his big villains have a very definitive ends. By continuing the series, you're working to undermine that end. But let's talk about a couple of these specifically, how that might impact them. On a lot of the covers, we see that Venom is going to play a big part in this. He's on every cover, he's front and center in all this promotion for the 94 comic. Venom has a definitive end in the series. He redeems himself, trying to stop Dormammu, and is trapped in the Dark Dimension, along with Carnage and Dormammu and Mordo and all that. So already we gotta think, how do we get Venom out of this dimension? Well, maybe there's some interdimensional travel and he frees himself, whatever. Okay, so his first instinct is to attack Spider-Man? I mean, that could work. I mean, maybe he's bitter about Spider-Man trapping him in there, or maybe he blames Spider-Man and not Iron Man, who was also equally responsible for that whole fight scene. It was, Spidey, Iron Man, and Venom versus Carnage, Mordo, and Dormammu. Great combination, by the way. So what's Venom's motive? Why is he going to fight Spider-Man? Why is he a bad guy here when he just redeemed himself in the previous episode arc? There's no indication that he's going to hold on to this grudge there. It seems like his arc has kind of led to a conclusive element, with him redeeming himself, being a hero. Why is he then going back on that? Would that undermine the progress he made in the cartoon? Would it weaken the original story? It's hard to say. It depends what they come up with, of course, and all of this is speculation, but I can't help but feel they're going to undermine the hard work it took to make that story in the first place. To tell that narrative, they may have to walk back some of the more progressive, interesting ideas the cartoon presented in the first place. But there's something else I want to point out too. We mentioned there's going to be some cross-dimension hopping, because after all, the original cartoon ended with Spider-Man going with Madam Web to find Mary Jane, who was, again, during a fight with Green Goblin, sent spiraling through reality and lost. But if you notice on the cover, there's a new character at play, who we can assume is going to play a major part. In fact, let's go in there. Zoom. Enhance. No, a little down. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. Right there. That's Morlun, isn't it? Like, that's not a character that showed up in the show before. That's Morlun. Morlun from the JMS run of Spider-Man, an interdimensional traveler who sucks on the totemic energy of heroes. Morlun of the Inheritors. The Inheritors who sparked off the original Spider-Verse saga. The idea that they're these cross-dimensional hunters of those who embrace the spider totem. What's Morlun doing here? Is he going to play a role? Is he going to be introduced? Now, of course, the cartoons have always introduced characters from the comics, but this is interesting because Morlun is a character that came about after the original series ran its course. This would be a diversion from the original plans Semper had for the Spider-Man cartoon should it get a 6th season. After all, Semper's original plan was for Madam Web to guide Peter Parker into an alternate version of the 19th century, specifically 19th century London, where Mary Jane would be pursued by Jack the Ripper. I guess this means that she'd be one of the ladies of the Night of the Whitechapel, but, kids' cartoon, they won't have to go into that detail of what people Jack the Ripper hunted. And they were going to reveal that Jack the Ripper was in fact Carnage. Or at least Cletus Cassidy anyway. Maybe full Carnage, who knows, but Morlun is a big divergence from 19th century London. Not that you have to be faithful to the original plans, not that you have to swear allegiance to what Semper originally had in mind, but it's an interesting trend, isn't it?
Actually, let's talk about that unproduced 6th season, because we actually know generally what Semper would have done in that season. And there doesn't seem to be any plans for Kingpin to return, but rather Richard Fisk, his son, would have taken the role of the Rose in order to spread crime and inherit his father's crime empire. Kingpin would still be in jail at the end of season 5. Mysterio, however, would have turned out to be alive after his apparent death in season 4, and would have, due to manipulating the time dilation accelerator, the same device that had sent just about everyone into other dimensions, including Mary Jane, Green Goblin, Venom, etc., would have used the device to become Dormammu's newest servant, or rather would have played with the device and stumbled onto Dormammu, who would exploit Mysterio's ambitions and desires to return to the real world again, now that Mordo, Carnage, and Venom were all lost. Apparently, Spidey would also team up with Ghost Rider in order to stop Dormammu once and for all, which sounds awesome. Norman Osborn would have returned and become the Green Goblin once more after Harry redeemed himself at Peter Parker's wedding. The villainous Puma, Jack-o'-lantern, Beetle, and most worryingly, the Jackal would have shown up. The Jackal, of course, being the guy responsible for all the clones in the Clone Saga.
Really hate clones.
Also, Hulk would have been there, somewhere. Also, Betty Brant would have shown up as a supporting character at the Daily Bugle. There would also have been a tribute to Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends, where Peter would team up with Iceman and Firestar. All of this sounds great, but none of this involves Morlun, who, I remind you, wasn't created in the 90s.
Now, granted, the X-Men 97 cartoon also incorporated plot points that were created after the show wrapped up. 97 prominently featured the destruction of Genosha, an event that happened during the Grant Morrison X-Men run. But Genosha changes the status quo of the story completely. So yeah, it's going to be a good transition point into a new era of X-Men. But Morlun doesn't really change the status quo of Spider-Man all that much. Yes, the Inheritors are tied up with Spider-Verse, and that event changed the status quo. But the original story with Morlun, during the JMS run, didn't actually change status quo all that much. It introduced the new JMS run of Spider-Man very nicely, yes, but Morlun's presence of sucking totemic energy doesn't radically change the narrative the same way that destroying Genosha with Sentinels does in X-Men. Rather, it opens up an interesting door for a specific adversary, but doesn't really change what it means for Spider-Man to exist. Granted, Spider-Man might encounter him on his cross-dimension hopping with Madam Web, and Madam Web might be hunted too by Morlun. That could be interesting, and that might be what they're going for. But Morlun as a threat just isn't as appealing as, say, Bastion is for X-Men 97, or the destruction of Genosha is for X-Men 97. Now granted, Bastion and the destruction of Genosha were not tied in intrinsically in the original comics. Cassandra Nova is responsible for the destruction of Genosha in the Grant Morrison run. However, by switching out Cassandra Nova with Bastion, Bo DeMeo was able to kind of make this very interesting dynamic with the Sentinels hunting mutants and all that, and play into some interesting ideas of bigotries and what have you. Morlun doesn't come with that though, and to put Morlun in front and center in the cover as the only new character we see already being confirmed for the series, as opposed to Jack-o'-lantern or Puma or the Rose or whoever Semper originally had in mind, it sets an interesting idea. How is Morlun going to be front and center in this narrative? Will he be the main villain? Will he be like a side character? Will he be instigating things on the crossroads? Like, what's going on here? Is he holding Mary Jane hostage? We don't know. And granted, I don't expect to know everything by the comic before it's released. We have to wait for it to come out. It could be a really good twist. I don't know. But it does bode interestingly, if that's what they're going for.
And I'll be honest, this might be controversial, but in regards to Spider-Verse, every adaptation of that original comic storyline has found more interesting ways to cross the Spider-Folks over than the original conflict of the Inheritors, including the 90s cartoon, Spider-Carnage. He's a personification of what Peter Parker could be if he let the weight of the world break him, as well as a callback to the Black Suit storyline that kicked off the Venom saga back in the cartoon's first season, one of the most iconic storylines of the animated show. And Spider-Carnage is a vastly more interesting villain as a result than Morlun and his family, who is basically just going to be like Morbius was in the second season of the cartoon if adapted into this 90s universe. He's a blood-sucking fiend who has to touch you to drain you. So essentially, Morlun would be a slightly less interesting version of Morbius, because rather than having suckers on his hand that drains the plasma from your veins, he just touches you and drains your totemic energy. Maybe, unless they find a way to change that into something completely unlike itself otherwise.
And again, all of this assumes that Morlun, due to his appearance on the cover, is indeed a major villain. But let's be honest, if you're getting a brief return to this continuity, wouldn't you want to see characters from the continuity be the main threat? Why would you want to see an original villain when you can have the Norman Osborn come back, or Venom? Again, that's what putting Venom on front and center, but I'm wondering something here. If we're going through alternate dimensions, are we even going to get the versions of the villains that we like? That's the other thing too. Because we're going in alternate dimensions, we might be getting alternate dimension versions of the villains. This was established in the Spider-Verse crossover at the end of the original animated series, where we met alternate versions of Hobgoblin, Green Goblin, and Kingpin. Fighting them was not as cathartic as fighting the versions that we had gotten to know over the 5 seasons prior. It was unfulfilling to see Spider-Man beat Kingpin when it was a new version of the Kingpin. So are we getting Venom from the original cartoon? Or are we getting a variant of Venom that's new to the story and thus less fulfilling for Spider-Man to encounter? There won't be any shared history, there won't be any shared conflict. It won't be an opportunity to have the characters grow from the cartoon. Or is it Venom transplanted in dimensions? Again, that's possible with Venom and it's possible with Green Goblin. But the rest of the villains, not so much because they're all on the main dimension that Spider-Man left. So Venom and Green Goblin are the only villains, if we're going dimension hopping, who can theoretically materialize in the way of Spider-Man as an opposition and be the same characters we know from the original cartoon. Otherwise, we're getting variants. We're getting new characters with the same face. And that's not interesting to me to see. I don't care about Spider-Man fighting a new version of Venom. We already saw him fight a new version of Green Goblin, and it meant nothing to the audience, and it was treated as a minor deviation of the plot. It wasn't really seen as a major conflict in the two-part finale. So that has me a little worried. What are we getting here? Are we getting a fulfilling conclusion to character arcs? Or are we getting something hollow and empty, without the catharsis and characterization that made the original cartoon so compelling in the first place?
At least that's what I'd say if something didn't happen right as I was finishing. Less than a day before this video goes live, some interior art from Spider-Man 94 issue 1 came out. And let's take a look at it real quick. We got two images here, basically a shot of Spidey swinging with Mary Jane, and a shot of Spidey with the various events from the last couple of seasons of the show behind him. In another page, we see Peter and MJ, it looks like they've had a fight or an argument or disagreement, while Kane, one of the clones of Spider-Man, looks overhead. Now I want to point out that Kane has not appeared yet in the cartoon in any form, so this is yet another character new to the cartoon along with Morlun. However, unlike, say, Morlun, there is some ties to Kane possibly appearing. The Jackal has been alluded to in the past as one of the plans Semper had for Season 6, and Ben Reilly was introduced in the Spider-Verse crossover. And don't forget, Spider-Carnage's motivation is that he really, really hates clones. At least that's part of why he lost his mind. Another page we see Aunt May watching as Peter and MJ walk into the house, while on another panel we see Spidey fighting the Molten Man outside of a tribute to Semper at Semper's Fine Jewelry, which I'm sure is a nice reference to Semper, but it would be better if he was being paid at all for his creations being incorporated in this comic. Now, right away, something else that you might notice is how strange Peter's face looks in some of these panels. This art does not at all resemble the version of Peter that was in the 94 series originally. It looks way too boyish in some shots and way too, I don't know, frail in others and weird and off-kilter. Noteworthy is at the original cartoon, Peter was basically built like a linebacker, so this feels very odd. Yeah, it's probably close to what Spider-Man should look like design-wise, but it is odd seeing it here presented in such a way. None of these pages inspired me with much confidence, and further, considering that we're going to be having Morlun somewhere in this comic, considering he's on the front cover, it does seem a little odd we have Kane and Molten Man, two characters that were not teased on any of the promotion thus far, having such a prominent role in these first couple interior art pages from the comic.
It would be more compelling if Peter goes off to find Mary Jane in this multiverse with Madam Web, and they stumbled into, say, the Green Goblin, Venom, and or Dormammu on their travels. Hell, Dormammu makes a more interesting final boss than Morlun because Dormammu, Spidey has encounters with. They have a history with. And Dormammu was one of the original planned big bads of Season 6, as Semper said. Yes, Mysterio was the planned avatar of Dormammu, whatever, but Venom can just as easily be included in that too. Or Green Goblin, someone who's more tied in with Mary Jane disappearing in the first place. And that might be what they plan, something interesting like that to tie in these older characters together. Because again, these are the only characters who crossed dimensional vortexes. But there's one other thing, isn't there? Because this isn't the Spider-Man series that Spider-Man fans that are very hardcore have wanted to see. Yes, I mean, the 90s show is popular, it has its audience, people want to see it come back. But unlike X-Men 97, there have been a lot of other Spider-Man shows to come out since the 90s. Like, yeah, X-Men had X-Men Evolution, and that had a good ending. It kind of wrapped itself up nicely. It felt like it was a good time to wrap up X-Men Evolution. I like how X-Men Evolution ends. And they had Wolverine and the X-Men, which was lasted for a season and falls in the camp of the Silver Surfer cartoon and Spider-Man Unlimited in terms of unfulfilled potential for shows that could have been better if they just kept going, but I digress. But you know what Spider-Man cartoon fans want to see continue? If you ask the average Spider-Man fan, there's a 75% chance they won't say the 90s cartoon, they'll say the Spectacular Spider-Man. The Spectacular Spider-Man ended prematurely due to a deal arranged with Sony and Disney over the production of animated properties. By all accounts, nothing that replaced Spectacular Spider-Man had the former's nuanced storytelling, its magnificent adaptation of established characters, or the unique overarching plot that drove action from plot point to plot point. Much like the 90s show, it had many episodic storylines, but these episodic storylines were themselves chunks of 3 or 4 episodes apiece, which then built to a longer season-running arc, which itself built to something bigger, something we never saw because the show ended prematurely. I would much rather see Spectacular Spider-Man come back, especially considering that the people who made Spectacular Spider-Man have worked with Disney, and I guess would come back, like Greg Weisman, he did Gargoyles. Bring him back. He's still on Disney's payroll, right? I mean, at least you wouldn't be like John Semper who gets, screwed. Bring back the original creator for that. Why not? They have the rights now. They could easily do it. I would vastly want that story to continue, because unlike Spider-Man from the 90s, which had a story and wrapped up, Spectacular Spider-Man got cut off. It never got to finish even a fraction of its ideas. There's so many ideas that the creators have said they wanted to do, but they couldn't because they were screwed by business decisions. Unlike the 90s cartoon, which had its time and ran its course and wrapped up most of its storylines, we never got a conclusion to this one. So why can't we get this? Why do we have to have this 90 thing? I know why. It has nothing to do with Spider-Man. The reason this comic exists at all has nothing to do with Spider-Man as a character or any plot point that was unfulfilled. It has everything to do with another cartoon revival.
Of course, we all know why this comic is being made, and it's not in service of Semper's Spider-Man cartoon. It's in service of X-Men 97. X-Men 97 showed Peter and Mary Jane together. Therefore, we need an explanation as to how this happened, to fill in a plot point we knew was going to happen anyway, explicitly. Granted, we're getting one of the best Spider-Man storytellers of all time to tell us how we got there, but at the end of the day, this comic exists to fill in a plot hole for another cartoon. And while this project might inspire confidence in Disney to maybe either create an animated 6th season of the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, or just include more Spider-Man and X-Men 97, it doesn't change the fact that this whole project is happening to help another story. It's not for the fans, it's for the continuity of the 90s cartoon universe.
Now, despite all these misgivings, the comic can be really good. It really can. This is all my red flags and my concerns coming through. But it's not to say that it's going to be terrible. It might be a really great comic. I would love to be wrong. I want this video to age like rotten milk in the summer in 100-degree weather. It's 100 degrees while I'm filming this, so I'm talking about that. But I can't toss out my concerns. I can't just dismiss them all out. I would love to be wrong, but there are several red flags I'm seeing, and it's painting my judgment of this show. Will it be great? Possibly. Will I look back on this and laugh? You maybe. If the comic is good, I will do a reaction pinpointing every single thing with this video I got wrong or predicted wrong. If I'm right and it still turned out good, I will still do a reaction to this video when the comic is out in its entirety. But until then, I just am concerned that it's going to be disappointing. And I want to get my thoughts out, because there's not really a good avenue for that. And I have a YouTube channel, so might as well. So, there you go. Hope you've enjoyed my rants. Hope you find it interesting. And Disney, Spectacular Spider-Man Revival when? Also, if you haven't seen, Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is really good too. I like that cartoon. What your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man did was take a lot of characters who you don't normally think of as core Spider-Man antagonists or villains or characters, really, and made them really interesting in that world. I love what they did with Nico. I love what they did with Tombstone. It's really neat and interesting, and I dig it. Also, Doc Ock is fantastic. This is peak Doc Ock design. I love it. But yeah, no. So I hope the comic's good, but I'm not holding my breath. That being said, though, I am hyped about Crypto and Jeff crossing over. So we got that going for us. So there you go. Nothing else. We got Jeff and Crypto hanging out. That's always good.
You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the